I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about a subject that is a little touchy to get into out there on the Facebook page. So I'm going to put it here on the Patreon page because this is where we go a little deeper into the subjects that we talk about out there, but here on the Patreon page we can dive a little deeper. And this is a subject that I've seen come up in a few contexts lately, and it's the subject of people who try to use other people. Every now and then we will hear things in the media about sociopaths and psychopaths. And I, as a therapist, my area of primary practice is in working with people who have histories of abuse and trauma. And as you can imagine, the folks with whom I work have more than their share of experience with people who fit these distinctions of sociopaths and psychopaths. And the reason why it's important to be very realistic about what sociopathy is, what psychopathy is, and the reason why it's important to think realistically about how to handle these phenomenon as we encounter them out there in the real world in our lives is because sociopaths and psychopaths really will ruin your life and really will not think twice about it. I ran across a one of these kind of personal growth teachers, self-help teachers, saying that, man, we only ever encounter out there in the world things that we project out there into the world. Therefore, if you are encountering a situation that you do not like, you have to look at yourself and see how you projected that out into the world. And it's a form of these teachings that kind of fall into this metaphysical camp of kind of this law of attraction teaching. There's a pseudo-spiritual teaching out there called the law of attraction that, you might be familiar with. I know a lot of people who are interested in my material do have some experience in kind of the self-help genre. And so you've probably come across kind of this law of attraction stuff. And the gist of the law of attraction stuff is we live in a vibrational universe, right? Everything is vibrating. The molecules of everything is vibrating. And the things that are drawn into our experience are drawn into our experience vibrationally, right? So we can only ever attract things that are consistent with our own vibration. Therefore, if you are attracting things into your life that are bad, you should take a look at your own vibration. Because the only things that will ever be attracted into your experience are things that are consistent with your own vibration. All right. So as you can imagine, I've had experience with some patients who have been abused and who have been traumatized, but who have been exposed to this teaching that you only ever attract into your life that which you are projecting out into the world. You are drawing things vibrationally into your life by the vibration that you are practicing and you're putting out there into the world. And they're asking themselves, wow, I don't remember putting out there into the world that I wanted to be abused and neglected and traumatized. Yet they are in this position where they're blaming themselves because they've been told that, that you will only ever experience a reflection of what you project, right? So it's really important to, really kind of clarify what it means to encounter a sociopath or a psychopath, or in a broader sense, what it means when bad things happen to good people, to innocent people. Look, the research into psychopathy and sociopathy tell us a few interesting things. It's important to understand that most of the research that we have about psychopathy and sociopathy come from what are called forensic populations. And I actually encountered this when I was doing my clinical psychology training. They make us do, at the tail end of our training experience, like when we finish up all our coursework, they make us do a 1 year, what's called an internship. And that's kind of this immersive experience in a clinical setting. And my internship happened to be in a forensic setting. And so for a little over a year, basically what I did was an awful lot of assessment and therapy with people who were in the forensic state hospital. So they were in the state psychiatric hospital because they had an encounter with the legal system. Usually it was the case that they had been accused of a crime, but they had been found not psychologically competent to stand trial because of their psychiatric issues. You know, they had problems with reality testing, and they had problems, understanding why they were, why their freedom was being taken away. You know, their mental illness got in the way, and so they were given to our team, and our job was to assess them really well and do the work with them that they needed done to kind of get to the point of being psychologically competent to stand trial, or fit to stand trial in some states it's called. So I had a great deal of experience in working with people who had been accused of crimes, and it's an important distinction that they had not been convicted of crimes. It was not at that point in the process, but they had been arrested, and they had charges standing against them. So in order to work effectively with this population, I had to get really familiar and receive a lot of training in what is known about forensic patients. And so this issue of psychopathy and sociopathy very frequently came up because, as you can imagine, in forensic populations and court-ordered populations, psychopathy and sociopathy is overrepresented. So it's important to understand that most of what we know about psychopathy and sociopathy comes from these forensic populations, right? There have been a few kind of really broad studies involving kind of a representative sample of the entire population to really tell us much about how many sociopaths and how many psychopaths are really, really out there. Okay, we don't really know. What we know, we basically know from those psychopaths and those sociopaths who got caught. Okay? What this implies, the reason why I'm telling you this, is what we know about psychopathy and sociopathy is mostly gleaned from psychopaths and sociopaths who their plans didn't work out. Either they had, they had planned poorly, or something had gone wrong with their plans. They weren't as smart as they thought they were, and that's a thing, particularly with psychopaths. They tend to think they're smarter than they actually are. Like, there is a phenomenon called malignant narcissism. That's an associated phenomenon of psychopathy. And so in malignant narcissism, the person tends to think that they're smarter than they are, and they weren't, which is why they ended up in our system, right? All of which is to say that if you look at the official data, the official statistics, or what we think we know about psychopathy and sociopathy, you're going to read that psychopaths and sociopaths make up a pretty small percentage of the population. But what's important to understand about that is we really don't know, okay? We know that it is a comparatively small subset of sociopaths and psychopaths who get caught, right? But that only accounts, there's what we call a confounding variable. Like that only accounts for those psychopaths and those sociopaths who got caught. So we actually don't have a lot of good data about how likely you are in the course of a day to encounter a psychopath or a sociopath. What we can extrapolate from the data that we do have is that if you run into a psychopath or a sociopath and they are not incarcerated, that means one of two things. That means either they have not gotten caught yet, like they haven't, either they haven't done something that would result in them having experience with the forensic system, i.e. getting put in jail, right? Or they have done something like that and they are intelligent enough, smooth enough to not get caught. I tend to think it's more the latter, and I'll tell you why. As part of the diagnostic criteria for sociopathy and psychopathy, and there's a pretty fine distinction between those two conditions. And I could do a whole video about what makes one different from the other, and I don't think that'd be terribly useful in a practical sense. But when we're talking about sociopaths in particular, what we're usually talking about are people who have who are diagnosable in the DSM nomenclature with antisocial personality disorder. And what that is a person who truly thinks that the rules don't apply to them. Okay? It's not the case that they can't appreciate that we live in a society and it has rules. It's the case that they truly think that, or they don't care. Like they truly think that that stuff applies to somebody else and not to them, right? As you can imagine, antisocial personality disorder is often what we call comorbid, like exists at the same time with a condition called narcissistic personality disorder. And the difference between these two personality disorders, because narcissists have a lot of the same symptomatology. The only difference is narcissists are not always bad people, what we think of as bad people. Narcissists are frequently not out to hurt anybody. With the narcissists with whom I've worked, it's usually the case that they are confused to find that the rules don't, or that the rules do apply to them, right? Like they think that the rules don't apply to them, and when they are told that the rules do apply to them, they're kind of confused. They're like, oh, God, that never occurred to me that the rules do apply to me. Somebody who has antisocial personality disorder, who is a true sociopath, they would not be confused by that. Like they would get that. They would get, yeah, I get it. I get that the rules are supposed to apply to me, but guess what? They really don't. Okay? So there's a fine line between narcissism and antisocial personality disorder. Psychopathy is a somewhat larger, a somewhat broader distinction. In fact, the word psychopath actually comes from the word psychopathology, which basically just means pathology of the psyche. It means there's something wrong with the psychological apparatus of a person. But it's a broader term that it encompasses sociopathy, like, sociopaths tend to be psychopaths. But it goes a little broader in that, look, we may not know what makes a psychopath tick. Like, we may not know. Like, they may have antisocial personality disorder. They may not. They may have something else going on. We really don't know. And that's what makes psychopaths a little scarier, because we don't know what makes them tick. Sociopaths, we can kind of form some hypotheses, some working hypotheses about what's going on with them. Like the research base is a little more robust when it comes to studying personality disorders. Psychopathy is still largely a mystery to us. Like we really don't have a handle on, are people born psychopaths? Are people made psychopaths by their experience? What we think is that it's kind of a combination of the two. There's a concept in psychology called the diathesis stress model, which means that people tend to be born with dispositions and then they're exposed to certain environmental factors that, result in whatever. But all of which is to say that when it comes to psychopaths, when it comes to sociopaths, but particularly when it comes to psychopaths, as they exist out there in the wild, like not just in the controlled forensic system, as they exist out there in the wild, we don't have a lot of data. Therefore, we really don't know how likely it is that you're going to encounter a psychopath or a sociopath. Here's what I can tell you. I can tell you that abusive, exploitative relationships are a lot more common than people think. I can tell you that there is an awful lot of pressure out there in the world. Like if you are being exposed to an abusive, exploitative relationship, there's an awful lot of pressure on you to not realize that. I can tell you that we live in a culture that tends to, in some ways, kind of reward sociopathy. Now, what do I mean when I say that? What I mean is, if your goal is success, okay, like your goal is to get the job, get the raise, get the romantic partner, experience the kind of sexual experiences you want to experience, get the things that you would like to possess. Like if those are your goals and you happen to be a sociopath, like you don't think that the normal rules apply. Like, so for example, a normal rule of civilized society is if I have a thing that you want, you can't just come shove me and take that thing, right? Like that's a rule. If you're a sociopath, you don't think that applies to you. You may be smart enough to kind of figure out that you need to figure out a way to push me and take my thing without having me retaliate or without you winding up in the forensic system. You might be that smart, but you would have no compunction about the fact that, look, I'm going to get shoved in that process and I'm going to get my stuff taken away, right? Like you don't have, the conscience to appreciate why that's a bad thing. So we live in a culture that kind of rewards sociopathy. If our only goal is getting what we want when we want it, it pays to be a sociopath. Right? Because you're not encumbered by the rules and you're not encumbered by a conscience. You're not encumbered by, this pesky thing called empathy. Okay? It's important to understand that, again, there are lots of people out there who are not exposed to the healthy developmental experiences that would otherwise reinforce them for following the rules. Now, what do I mean when I say that? What I mean is that there's an awful lot of lousy parenting and lousy mentoring out there. We want to think that most human beings, as they're growing up, have experiences whereby their parents and the other adults surrounding them as they're growing up provide those kids with enough positive, constructive mentoring experiences that they develop, kind of normal, capacities for empathy. If we go back to Freudian theory, actually, Freud had a really good set of theories about how do we develop what's called a conscience. Like Freud thought that our personalities were kind of split along three lines, right? Like, so Freud thought that, okay, we have the power of personality that he called the id, which is the power of personality that just wants what it wants when it wants it, right? Like that's that part of our personality that really likes sex and violence and stimulation and stuff and doesn't really have any compunction about how it gets it. And he postulated this other part of our personality called the superego. And the superego was split into two parts in and of itself. And part of the superego is called the ego ideal, which is kind of like the inherited values and voices of our parents and our mentors. And the other part of the superego was called the conscience. And that's kind of the internalized cultural stuff about, what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, kind of all these things. And then Freud postulated a third part of the personality called the ego that kind of moderates between the id and the superego. And psychoanalysis, like if you ever go into psychoanalysis, you're going to be learning an awful lot about id, ego, and superego because the entire therapeutic technique of psychoanalysis is about getting these three parts of your personality to play nicely with each other so that your life is a train wreck, right? Anyway, we like to think, and Freud liked to think, that like think about what I just told you about the superego, okay? Part of the superego, the ego ideal, is the voices of our parents, right? Supposedly, hopefully, the good, constructive, consistent experiences that you have with your parents that teach you how to be a human being out there in the world. The other part of the superego being the conscience, which is that that those experiences with the culture, and that would encompass religion, that would encompass good teachers that you had, that would that hopefully give you a framework inherited from the culture about how to be a good, constructive, empathic human being out there, right? We like to think that we have enough constructive experiences with parents and with the culture to flesh out that superego and to go out there and be, good, constructive human beings. Like we like to think that most people have enough of a superego to balance out that id, to balance out that, that id that just wants what it wants when it wants it, right? What I can tell you as a therapist is that a lot of us did not have those experiences. Again, we want to think that most people did, and a lot of people did. I'm not trying to say that nobody did. But what I am trying to be realistic about is the fact that a lot of people did not. A lot of people did not have those constructive modeling experiences with their parents. A lot of people had experiences with their parents where they were told one thing and shown another thing. A lot of people had experiences with parents or caregivers who were neglectful, who just were not there, right? A lot of people had really lousy, kind of on the other side of that superego equation. A lot of people had really lousy experiences with the culture growing up. Like right now, like an increasing chunk of my business as a therapist, and as a therapist with a particular interest in religious issues, an increasingly large part of my business is people who have had negative experiences with the church, right? People who grew up hearing one thing and then having another thing demonstrated to them. And in the worst cases, it was demonstrated to them via abuse. All of which is to say that when we don't have those constructive experiences, when we don't have what Madeline Klein, who's a psychoanalytic theorist, what she called good enough parenting experiences, and that can happen from both the culture and from our actual parents. We grow up with our circuits kind of scrambled. Does this mean that we turn out to be sociopaths or psychopaths? Well, no, it does not. Some folks do. And I would make the argument that more folks than you'd think do end up being sociopaths or psychopaths. All of this is kind of a roundabout way of me trying to communicate to you that I think there are more sociopaths and psychopaths out there than any one of us would ever suspect. So we have to be realistic about that, right? But it can also scramble our circuits insofar as when we grow up with those lousy shaping experiences, those lousy conditioning experiences, something can break inside of us where we are really lousy at protecting ourselves from psychopaths and sociopaths. Now, I want you to think about this. I want you to think about what happens when the adults around you, you're growing up, you're a skull full of mush, ready to be conditioned by the world. What happens when you're growing up and the adults around you are abusive or exploitative? That's not just the modeling you have, but that's the experience that you have. It may not turn you into a psychopath or a sociopath, but it may give you a pretty distorted idea of what is okay in a relationship, what is acceptable in a relationship. Something that a lot of my trauma survivor patients have to kind of work through is, look, why do I consistently wind up in relationships where I'm getting abused and neglected and treated poorly? And why do I stay in these relationships? Why do I have such a hard time setting boundaries in these relationships? Why do I get into a string of these relationships again and again and again? There are red flags. Why do I not see those red flags? I can see them in retrospect, but why do I not see them when they're happening? For that matter, when I get out of a lousy relationship, an abusive or an exploitative relationship, why do I sometimes miss my abusive partner? It's very confusing to folks. It gets less confusing when you start to understand that, okay, where do we form our schemas? Like that's psychologist jargon for our fundamental beliefs. Where do I get my schemas about what relationships are and what is okay in relationships and what is to be expected in relationships and what is important to pay attention to and what is important to kind of overlook in relationships? Well, when we have those lousy developmental experiences, there's our answer, right? So things to kind of have on your radar screen about psychopathy and sociopathy. There are more of them out there than you think, and a lot of us are underprepared to deal with them, especially if you're coming from a background of abuse or neglect. And we have to be real about this. I'll tell you why we have to be real about this too, is because there's a lot of pressure, as I said a moment ago, there's a lot of pressure in our culture to kind of overlook bad behavior. Bad behavior is often rewarded in our culture. It's really, really important if we're going to go out there and be competent individuals, if we're going to create lives that are not just satisfying and pleasant, but also fundamentally safe, like safe on emotional levels, safe on physical levels, we have to be realistic about the fact that we are going to run into this in the real world, okay? And we should not, allow ourselves to be distracted by this idea, that again, if you look into the statistics or the research that's done, this is sociopathy and psychopathy, they're a very small percentage of the population. I'm telling you that when you start to go into those numbers don't actually hold up. We actually really don't know. And we actually have cause to believe that there are way more sociopaths and way more psychopaths out there. So how do we actually deal with them? The best line of defense against sociopathy and psychopathy is two-pronged. One has to do with a very high level of awareness, both self-awareness and awareness of the world, right? And the other has to do with a high level of self-esteem. And a subset of skills that goes along with having self-esteem is skills that revolve around assertiveness and boundary setting. Okay? I'm going to talk about both of these just a bit. I know I've been rambling for about a half hour at this point. So I wanted to go into these just a little bit, and then I'll let you go for tonight, because we're going to be talking about these an awful lot here in the coming days and weeks. But why is awareness so important? Well, awareness is really, really important because if you don't know you're being exploited, you don't know you're being exploited. Okay? We really need to develop a sense of the world that depends on us being vigilant. And I don't mean hyper vigilant. I don't mean you have to go out there and be paranoid. I truly don't. We often see folks, especially folks who have been traumatized, go out there and they live in their life as if trauma's going to jump out around every corner. And I think that's kind of maladaptive. I think that's exhausting. I think it's unnecessary. That said, we also need to be realistic enough about the world to have a sense of, okay, look, this really is a red flag. Now, what stands in the way of us knowing about red flags? Usually it's factors inside of us. Usually it's blind spots that we have developed. Again, why? Said just a moment ago, right? Because we had lousy developmental experiences that kind of put blinders on us around red flags. So if we are really serious about protecting ourselves from sociopathy and psychopathy out there in the world, we need to do our very best to learn about our own blind spots and to learn what it feels like and what it looks like to be out there in the world and to maintain a high level of awareness. Again, without being hypervigilant, without being paranoid. And a lot of times it takes practice, okay? Like a lot of times, like this, this isn't an exact science. You're going to have trouble finding that balance. I'm telling you, you will. Okay? That doesn't mean we should stop looking for that balance. The other piece of the equation of handling sociopathy and psychopathy out there in the world is we need to have enough self-esteem to be willing to employ our skills and tools around assertiveness. Now, why does assertiveness require self-esteem? Well, assertiveness very often requires us to do things that are uncomfortable for us, such as setting boundaries. The only reason we're going to go through the hassle of setting boundaries is because we have the self-esteem, we have the self-regard, we have the self-protectiveness that is necessary to make it worth our while. Like, put another way, assertiveness is a way to protect ourselves. And if we're going to protect ourselves, we need to truly believe that we are worth protecting. Okay? So what I can tell you is that when you're making your priority lists in therapy, and if you're working with me, you know that I am so hardcore about lists and checklists and priority lists and mission statements, right? There's a lot of paperwork that comes with working with me in therapy. Like, as I'm sure there are a few people watching me right now who are working with me, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? But when you're making your lists, specifically your priority lists in therapy, we need to place all these things near the top of our list. We need to place awareness at the top of our list, both self-awareness and awareness out in the world. You've heard me talk about the Nathaniel Branden model of self-esteem. This falls under that first pillar of self-esteem, living with a high level of consciousness, living consciously, all right? We need to put that near the top of our priority list, and we also need to put self-esteem with that subset of skills and tools around assertiveness. We need to make that serious priorities. If you're working in the context of recovering from trauma, really, really important that these be super prioritized in your treatment. Because if we don't have a realistic framework for handling sociopathy and psychopathy out there in the world, one of two things is going to happen. I'm telling you, it's not if that's going to happen. This is going to happen. Either you are going to be unnecessarily vulnerable out there to people who are out there looking to exploit you and abuse you and neglect you. You're going to wind up in relationships that have a much higher probability of going bad and hurting you, okay? So we don't want that. But you're also going to, in addition to being vulnerable, you're also going to be, on the flip side, at risk of, again, being too anxious out there in the world to really create a life, right? Like, so what I talked about a moment ago about, trauma survivors tend to go through life really, really jumpy. And again, we come by it honestly. Like when you've been traumatized, you come by that kind of hyper awareness honestly. And I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to shame anybody for it. But it's a realistic fact that you really can't create the kind of life you want to create if you're jumping at everything coming around every corner. Okay. So I want you to really, really think about this. Like, my point with this video is to give you food for thought that you can then take into your therapy, that you can then take into your own personal development work and say, okay, boy, I really need to make this priority. I really need to make it a priority to get real about sociopathy and psychopathy out there in the world. And how can I actually deal with it in such a way that doesn't just, doesn't halt my life cold because I'm too afraid to go out there in the world, but also doesn't make me unduly vulnerable to these people out there in the world. So my very few words about psychopathy and sociopathy, as often happens, has kind of stretched into a half-hour talk. But what I want you to do with this talk is I want you to, you've now watched it. Go back and watch it a few more times, go back and, again, with all this material that I'm putting out there on the Patreon, what I really mean for this Patreon to be is stuff that you can really sink your teeth into and really dive into, really get some practical value. You're paying for this. So what I'd really encourage you to do is to kind of go back and chew on some of what I've said and really do some thinking about, okay, how is this operative in my life? How is this operative in my therapy? Okay. I want you to go forth. I want you to be nice to yourselves. Ciao.